All right, we are now recording. Hello, and welcome to the Online Creators Association's first pre-recorded stream. Tonight we're talking to Ariana from Consent Academy and Chel Miller from the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I am going to grab the introductions that I have for both of you. So Ariana Coveney is an ordained Shingon Buddhist monk with a background in psychology, linguistics, and education, focusing on violence prevention. She's lived in and worked all over the world doing grassroots activism for LGBTQ rights and domestic violence prevention. Her perspectives on harm reduction and accountability are based in her Buddhism and her Choctaw cultural heritage. Ariana, welcome to the stream.
Hello, thank you for having me. And I'm very excited to be here.
And Chel Miller is a social justice advocate living and working in New York's capital region. Professionally, they lead communications for the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault and serve on the advisory council of the New York Civil Liberties Union in the capital region chapter. Chel's work focuses on collective healing and liberation through good trouble, words and stories, system advocacy, training and resource development, and consulting. Chel, welcome to the stream.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And from here on, I am largely going to be leaving this call in Chel's hands because they are going to be facilitating this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us both here today. I thought we would open with a deep breathing practice that I find really useful in my work working with survivors of violence, as well as being a survivor myself, looking for ways to stay grounded in my body. So I am going to share my screen so that you can see a handout that I am using. One second. Okay. So I'm going to walk us through a square breathing exercise to just get us started. For folks who have not heard of this before, what we're going to do is you picture a square, and I've got a visual on the screen too for folks who don't really imagine visually very well. So at the very top of the square, what we do is we picture the top of the square and inhale for 4 seconds. And then we picture the next side of the square to hold, and then hold your breath for 4 seconds if you can. And then we exhale for 4 seconds, imagining the bottom of the square. And then we would rest for 4 seconds as we picture the final side of the square and complete it. I've seen this in other formats and slightly different. If you're not able to, inhale or hold your breath for 4 seconds, that's okay. But I figured we would start by doing this together. So I'm going to lead us through it now too. I'm going to do it as well. So we'll start with the inhale at the top. 2, 3, 4. Hold. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. And then rest. 2, 3, 4. And this is a technique that I've found is really helpful for when my mind starts to race and I feel my chest kind of tighten, my shoulders will tighten, and my jaw. And something that I've noticed is just trying to breathe more mindfully and taking deep belly breaths can really help ground me in the moment so I can get through the next 5 minutes. And this is the kind of exercise you can do where no one really knows you're doing a grounding exercise. So there's a little bit less anxiety over like, oh, do people see what I'm doing? For example. So I'm going to ask you to continue to do the square breathing while I read a greeting for us for us all to get us started. This is the Radical Gratitude spell from Adrienne Marie Brown. This is a spell to cast upon meeting a stranger, a comrade, or a friend working for social or environmental justice and liberation. And I wanted to bring it to this space in gratitude for Ariana for joining us, for TOCA, and for everybody who's watching. So I encourage you to keep doing the square breathing, some deep belly breaths, and just kind of absorb. You're a miracle walking. I greet you with wonder in a world which seeks to own your joy and your imagination. You've chosen to be free every day as a practice. I can never know the struggles you went through to get here, but I know you've swum upstream and at times it has been lonely. I want you to know I honor the choices you made in solitude, and I honor the work you have done to belong. I honor your commitment to that which is larger than yourself and your journey to love the particular container of life that is you. You are enough. Your work is enough. You are needed. Your work is sacred. You are here, and I am grateful. And again, that was a Radical Gratitude spell from Adrienne Marie Brown. Thanks, folks. So, Ariana, I'm really excited to be able to dive into a conversation with you today based on your work with the Consent Academy and, how we can understand consent more broadly in organizing and talking about consent and violence prevention online. Mm-hmm. So to really get us started, what is your, and the Consent Academy's approach to understanding and talking about consent?
Yeah, this is a good question because I think that when people hear the word consent, usually there's a lot of stuff that comes to mind. Usually they think immediately first about sex, and maybe they think about medical informed consent in the doctor's office, maybe. And they tend to think about it in a sort of negative sense, a scary sense of like making a mistake or having something bad happen to you or, ruining the fun. People say that a lot when we want to talk about consent. So at Consent Academy, our model is a risk reduction model. So we don't come in and say, here's how you do consent. This is what consent is. This thing is always consensual. This thing is never consensual. Sure, there are some things like on extreme ends, but generally speaking, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the grayness of consent, the spaces where we actually live our lives. And we talk about like different aspects of consent and things that affect it as a way to reduce the risk of violating someone else's consent or having our own consent violated. An example of that would be like in Washington State, where Consent Academy is based, technically, legally, you can't give consent if you've had any alcohol. And sure, that I see why they have that law, that makes sense. But if we get, say, people in our classes who are alcoholics or just people who really like to use alcohol, and it's, they and their partner really like to get drunk together and have sex or just kind of do anything. And then we come in and say, this is never consensual. Well, that's one, invalidating your whole relationship. And then also like, why would they listen to us? Why would they then think about consent? So what we instead talk about is like, the lower your capacity, the higher the risk. It's not to say it's impossible for the consent to be good or valid. It's just much, much riskier. And if both people have increasingly reduced capacity, the risk is going up even higher. So we talk about it in a risk reduction model. And it's really based in sort of psychology and philosophy. I would say that it's kind of like an ACT utilitarian philosophy in the sense of being impact is more important than intent. And that's really when consent is not upheld or when is not valid, we focus instead on the impact rather than the intent. behind what happened. Those are sort of the two main like big things: risk reduction and impact being more important than intent.
Yeah, I think this is a really useful framework for understanding consent, not just in sexual contexts, but more broadly. Could you speak to some of the work that Consent Academy does, in terms of understanding consent, not just in sexual contexts?
Yeah, for sure. So we've been around for 7 years now, give or take. And, I've only been the co-director since this past January, but I'd been volunteering with the Consent Academy for many years. And my first involvement with Consent Academy was actually, I was trying to create a coalition of Seattle swing dance community leaders, like teachers, educators, venue owners, musicians, DJs, to talk about some of the social issues we were having. And a friend of mine was like, hey, invite Consent Academy to come and give a short talk. They could help a lot with this. And then I liked them so much that I hired them to teach at my wedding. So Consent Academy came and gave a lecture on things like relationship agreements and consent in long-term relationships. At my wedding, I was like, I have a captive audience. Like, you don't have to come if you don't want to, but it would be great. So like teaching at weddings is one thing, but we've also taught for like Microsoft and Google. We've worked with the Amazon employees, things like the Linux Foundation. All these different sorts of groups have hired us to do things like teach them about how to have more consensual practices with interns. What do you do if your intern is 18 years old and has never had a job and has no idea about the fact that they're even allowed to set boundaries at work? We also work with things like, helping to train safety teams for events and helping community leaders know how to deal with issues happening in their communities before they get out of hand, and if possible, or if they've already gotten out of hand, sort of like how to help manage it, but really focused on harm reduction and risk reduction as much as possible before things become difficult. And we kind of do it because consent is part of everything. We can really apply it in any scenario. One of our sort of slogans is from the bedroom to the boardroom. I think it's pretty cute. I didn't come up with it, but I think it's pretty cute. And so we really do look at how we can support more consensual practices in sort of any scenario, whether it's a wedding or, teaching executives not to sexually harass their employees or like anything sort of in between.
Yeah, that's really helpful because in my experience working in the anti-sexual assault world, we also understand that when you have a good understanding of consent, how it works, how to navigate this in non-sexual contexts, we're more empowered and we understand how to navigate consent in sexual contexts too.
For sure.
Yeah, and so I really love this kind of idea too of talking about how we set boundaries, in workplaces, in our relationships. I love that you had an educational opportunity at your wedding. Note to self.
Yeah, my partner and I are big nerds, so we were like, let's have classes at our.
I love this.
Yeah.
It's like a little conference at your wedding.
Mm-hmm.
That's fantastic.
I also immediately was thinking what other major social events that occur that people sort of feel obligated to show up to? Could you just throw in a lecture? Sort of wondering about hosting parties where it's just halfway through the party there's a talk.
You can do. I've done that at my own parties. I've sometimes invited people over to watch movies that I will then annotate because I'm also a big nerd. I'm like, let me tell you why Alien is an incredibly feminist film, and pause to analyze it. But then also, just having these conversations in promoting this kind of thing in sort of daily life. I mean, people get so scared to talk about these things, and for so many reasons, even just in our consent basics workshops that before the pandemic, we would always host them at like public libraries in the Seattle area. And people would come there terrified of what we were going to say to them. And sometimes people would then, like, what we taught would help have them recontextualizing past experiences, and they would suddenly realize that something was really not consensual, and that would make them feel really stressed out, either that they had violated consent or that their own consent had been violated, or a mix of both. And, you know, like, people can feel a lot of fear around this, but really normalizing these discussions and making it part of daily life. I mean, I always try to encourage people to have the difficult conversations when they're easy. Don't wait until like it's really stressful to talk about, like, you know, boundaries around food at your house with your friends or something. Like, just set it up at the beginning and just say, like, hey, you know, like, you're always free to have, you know, any liquids that you want, but if you see a cake in the fridge, please don't just eat it or something. Don't wait until your friend's already eaten the cake to be like, why did you do that? So yeah, it's good to try to work it into everything.
Yeah, for sure. So you've talked a lot about some of the trainings and education that you've done in, you know, with different workplaces and like in-person settings. You also do a lot of consent education online. Can you speak more about how that might be different or how that goes in general?
Yeah, so it was really because of the pandemic. We had to, and it's really been honestly good because it's given us a much greater reach, first of all. And I moved out of Seattle. I'm now in Vienna, Austria, and it's allowed us to really expand well into Europe and to other areas and get a larger, you know, volunteer pool and people who are excited about these things. But also, one of the things that's really nice is that there are always benefits to teaching in person. It allows you to do different kinds of activities, to read the room better, to get a sense of if people are paying attention or engaged or feeling stressed out. But on the flip side, doing it online, if people are feeling like this is stressful or difficult, they can just turn their camera off and like walk away from their computer for a little while and then come back. Or like they can join one of our workshops and listen to it while they're going for a walk so that they can sort of process it while also trying to stay grounded in their body. Or, you know, we've had people show up to our workshops and they're clearly in the bath while they're at the workshop. So it allows us to connect with all different kinds of people and all different kinds of interesting situations. And it, I think, lowers some of the stress level because people don't have to then talk about something that might be really difficult while being seen. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of like, it's easier to talk about private and personal things if you're like wearing a mask or it's in the dark or people aren't looking at you. And I think that that benefits this kind of discussion as well. There's lower, you know, stress and barriers to opening the conversation. But it is also then harder on the educators because we can't like connect with people as well. Sometimes you get a class where 20 people are there and everybody's got their camera and their mic off the entire time, and you still got to teach the 2-hour class. So it's got its good points and its difficult points, but I think overall it's also one of the other really big things is it makes it fundamentally a lot more accessible. You know, you don't have to come in person, and we can put on like Zoom has a pretty decent active transcription feature. It's not perfect, but it does a really good job. It's pretty good, especially if the educators are speaking slowly and clearly. It's nearly perfect. And that helps a lot, as well as having the ability to share more sort of visual material and have key points written on slides for people to look at, to follow along. And that on just many, many levels, being able to teach it online makes it so much more accessible than only hosting them really in person. Or like if an organization wanted to hire us previously, it would usually mean they had to pay to fly us out there. And now we can do it on Zoom, and people are so used to it that it's a big benefit as well.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've seen as well as somebody who, hosts a lot of trainings for my organization. It's been really amazing to be able to offer webinars with speakers that, otherwise we might not have been able to afford to bring them in.
Yeah.
We're also able to get, a much broader reach than we typically would for, an in-person training or in-person conference. I can host up to 1,000 people in my Zoom webinar. That's a lot of people, but we've gotten pretty close.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah. So in addition to, trainings that you do online, you also are a pretty active streamer, if
Mhm.
I recall correctly. And I think in your experience and, based on the experiences of other folks we know who are doing consent education online and talking about violence prevention online, what are some of the challenges that you've seen creators and, consent educators encounter?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I got my start with streaming years ago with a nonprofit that doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. It was called Geek Space TV, and it was aimed at promoting diversity in role-playing games that are live streamed. So everybody who was part of the org was like queer or um, had a disability or is mixed race or POC or, some sort of intersection other than a lot of the live streaming shows that are really popular but are not diverse really at all. And so we built this really cool community around people who wanted that and felt then connected to that and represented. And of course, because even just on Twitch, having the tags like LGBTQ or like disabled or whatever, you'll get people who come in to spam the N word or like, you know, talk about how Trump is the best. Like we would get that. And some of the things that were good there is like, I think Twitch has done some, I mean, I don't want to say good because it's like this should have been a thing already, but has done some things to make it so that certain words are like automatically moderated, so that you get less of that. Though people have found a lot of ways to get around that. So like for me with my streaming, my like auto blocked words list, I went and found every variation I could of the N word, including things written in like leet speak, all the different levels of it, or like things meant to trick text to speech, like putting two words together that if you say them out loud it can sound really similar. And that took me a long time, and there's not like a list out there. My current auto blocked term list and sentence list is something like 500 terms. And at some point I'm going to publish that so that other people can take it and use it. But that was a huge investment on my part. And I did it before I even started really streaming, because I was like, I don't want to invite people into the space with me and not do my best to make it as, safe as possible and like not do my due diligence. The other things are like having moderators who, are aware of not only how to moderate, but also like what your community norms and standards are. Like I'm from the Boston area originally and I love to swear. So like I don't block swears on my stream. And we talk a lot about things like pornography and sex positivity. So I don't want to block words that have to do with things like sex acts. But there are other terms that like I do really want to block, or like certain sentences that someone might say that are related, but I'm like, I don't want this energy there. So making sure my moderators really know what we would like and what is okay to discuss, having like on our Discord a section just for our moderators, doing things to also celebrate and support our moderators, because it can often be a pretty invisible and thankless job. And so they deserve a lot of support for that. Sometimes when we have really specific events, Like if we're inviting someone on our Sunday streams, which are interview streams, like who is a sex worker, or specifically talking about like disability and sexuality, I like to get more moderators. So I'll like call out to my community, hey, anyone want to moderate just for this weekend stream? So those were the two things that were really a big deal. I think that's with online stuff, that's one of the really big risks, is just like the trolls, the sort of like hate raids, the harassment. Some of the other things are like, depending on the city or state you live in, you can preemptively let the local police department know that you're a streamer, so that if someone's trying to SWAT you, they know. But, you know, like my feelings about that are like, why is a SWAT team kind of the default approach to these things? And why is it so easy to call one? And like, just there's so many things there. And I'm glad that swatting has become something that the government's actually starting to take seriously and start to try to make laws around and protect people, but setting that up ahead of time. And then another aspect is like on social media, if I or any of our guests or anybody who like kind of gets big in these spaces, I always recommend like don't ever like post on Facebook or Instagram, Twitter, hey, I'm at this restaurant, isn't it so cute? Because people will show up. Like if you want to post about it, wait until after you've left and take the pictures of your food and like with your friends and the beautiful ambiance, and then wait until it's been an hour or so after you've left and then post it. Because even people who were really well-meaning and just excited, it's still kind of surprising and weird and stressful if people just come up to you and like, I know you from the internet. And I'm like, oh no. So those sorts of things are really big, like making sure people stay safe, trying to create a healthier sort of environment in terms of reducing the risk of mobs and trolls and reduce the toxicity. That's just on like, honestly, pure safety of things.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the strategies that you've talked about, like making it very clear what your values and what norms you want to encourage in that space and norms you want to discourage, you know, as well as, you know, encouraging people to, you know, protect their own privacy, you know, in terms of their location in some ways, and also leaning on community to help moderate the spaces, all seem to be really in line with your approach, you know, to harm reduction in this space. I think that's really helpful. You know, have you encountered, I know a lot of sex educators and consent educators online have encountered issues with like censorship from the platforms, and have gotten really creative about talking about, you know, sexuality and sex education and, you know, violence. Is that something you've encountered and have strategized around?
Not yet. I think we're not big enough yet. Or like our streaming stuff, we started experimenting with it a little bit last year, and then it really started in earnest this past January. I stream twice a week. Sundays are these interviews or chat streams. And then Tuesdays, I play Stardew Valley and talk about community consent and like things like infrastructure and how that affects your autonomy and stuff. Really, really nerdy things. And I have lots of digressions and everything on my Tuesday streams. But like, thankfully, so far we haven't. I spent a lot of time looking at things like YouTube and Twitch's sort of community standards. And there's a lot more leeway for things that are clearly for educational purposes. And because our account on both is a nonprofit account rather than just like an individual account that we're then talking about these things, there is thankfully a bit more of a buffer on that. You know, on the flip side, the episodes where we invite sex workers or talk about pornography are always the most popular ones. And it's nice and fun. And every once in a while, people come in and they're just like, hey, don't judge porn. And we're like, we're not. We're just talking about how to make it more consensual and better. And then they usually stick around because they realize we're not trying to, I don't know, I don't know what they think we're going to do. But anyway, thankfully, not really. I think it's also a lot of these companies are trying to do better on these things slowly. Like they've started to slowly get the message that the sort of hands-off but quick ban hammer kind of approach to a lot of things was actually creating itself a really toxic environment on these platforms and working to sort of undo that. So yeah, very much knock on wood though, because it could change. But I think being as a registered nonprofit and having our accounts be like clearly nonprofit accounts really helps with that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I manage communications and social media for a nonprofit as well, and haven't seen, at least on, platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, haven't seen the level of, sort of censorship that I've seen other, independent consent educators experience.
Mhm.
I think my favorite thing I've been thinking about is, on TikTok, the way to communicate lesbian in, text as La Dollar Bean. I think that's just the funniest thing to me. But kind of going back to the, the idea of promoting a safer and more inclusive online communities. We've talked a little bit about, the risk of kind of online mobs, swatting. There's also just kind of the everyday harmful behaviors that, I've seen people engage in online, and I'm sure you have. I think, in combination with some of the strategies that you've already outlined for how you create a safer online community, what are some other kinds of, everyday behaviors that we see online that are harmful, and ways that kind of just the everyday person can disrupt it?
Yeah, this is a big one. And this is one where like even my own consent practices can be better because for sure, like, whoever is the sort of like star of the day on Twitter, it's never a good thing. It's usually because they said something absurd and everyone's dragging them for it. And I have been known to occasionally like a tweet or two that had a really good burn in it. And I try to not do that. Definitely, I think one of the important things to say, just as someone who's a consent educator and is part of, the co-director of a consent nonprofit, there's no such thing as being perfect at consent. And like, there are plenty of things. I will admit that I personally can be very motivated by things like spite. And when it's just an internal thing, it's good. When I'm just like, yes, I'm really angry and this is firing me up and I'm going to do this work. Yes. But when it then affects how I treat other people, it's not good. And I like to be very honest about we can all always be doing better. When it comes to things like online hate, let me just start first by talking about like my Twitch community and my Discord community. So one of the things is like our Discord it's not just completely open. It's like if you subscribe to our Patreon or our Twitch, you get access to it. And then otherwise it's like we invite people in because we want it to grow slowly. We don't want to just get like big fast, and we want to be able to build the culture as we do that. But it's what you tolerate, even if you don't endorse it, eventually becomes your community. This is one of the things that I always say to any kind of organizer of any kind of subculture or group is that like your community, your values now and your community norms now will represent what the community actually looks like in 5 years. So like if right now you're like, we don't need codes of conduct and like whatever, no bad vibes here. Well, in 5 years, the only people who are going to be left are the people who are comfortable with a lot of harmful behavior. And online, this process is so much faster. It's like the span of a couple of months. You can go from having a community that's really friendly and supportive of each other and really open-minded and comfortable with disagreement and, can work through conflict to being like, it's all flame wars and like, mudslinging and call outs and, so some of the things that I think are really important just as a creator is, I always make sure that if I'm verbally punching, it's punching up. I try not to do anything like if I want to talk about things in, say, some billionaires' business practices, I don't then also insult the way that they look. And nothing like that. I, always make sure to never like kink shame. I might say this thing's not for me, but I'm not gonna, kink shame people. Really just being careful to be as non-judgmental as I can, as open-minded, and, even if I'm expressing frustrations, to be kind in it. Not necessarily nice, but kind. And then in online spaces, like if somebody says something really ridiculous and you would like to make a commentary on it, instead of quote tweeting that person, for example, screenshot it and then talk about it. That's a good way. Also, if you want to some famous author is spreading transphobia again, well, every time you quote tweet that person, the algorithm only cares about engagement. And so that gets that tweet in front of more people. So instead of quote tweeting and commenting, screenshot and commenting, a lot of people have been pointing this technique out for years. And then also just another aspect, and something we really haven't talked about, is always the understanding the difference in goals and outcomes of call outs versus call-ins. So like a call out is never for the benefit of the person being called out. It's always for the benefit of the bystanders, the people who are on the fence, the people who might be swayed by something someone has written, the people who sort of like haven't formed an opinion yet or could have their mind changed about something. And you tend to harm that relationship, if one exists, between you and the person you're calling out. And that sometimes is the appropriate and healthy goal. Like there are times where that is really a correct course of action, versus a call in is for the benefit of the person you're trying to hold accountable. And it doesn't necessarily have to end that or damage that relationship. It can strengthen it. And it gives people more grace to sort of like own their mistakes and deal with things. And, there's so much written by so many people who are not arguing in good faith about like cancel culture and call out culture. And I'm not trying to give credence to those people's sort of positions. I don't want to come and talk about the left is eating itself or anything like that. But there is truth to the fact that we should be mindful about what our goal actually is when we engage in certain kinds of, especially online behavior, especially from a place of emotion. These algorithms are aiming to manipulate us, to provoke emotions, especially anger. Like Twitter is for anger. Like it's basically like, I go on there a lot for the bird watching posts because I love to see all the bird pictures. And it's also it's an anger machine. And like, Instagram is the envy and bragging machine, and Facebook, I don't even know what Facebook is for, but like they're trying to provoke feelings because it keeps you engaged. And that doesn't mean you can't enjoy it or want to be engaged, but pause for a second and ask yourself, like, what is my actual goal here? And am I going to then act in alignment with that goal? And do I feel okay, like ethically, with the goal that I have right now? And so I think those are really good questions for us to always ask ourselves.
Yeah, I really appreciate, both kind of what you said about, if if a prominent author is saying some things online, instead of quote tweeting or responding directly and doing the screenshot, you also protect yourself from their followers in some ways, because you're not engaging directly with that post. Their followers are looking for those engagements, especially when they start to get those higher numbers of like quote tweets, likes, retweets. You do kind of set up a protective space for yourself. Something else I was thinking about, and I really appreciate your conversation or your statements about, call-ins and call-outs. And, I come from a mindset where each of those can be used strategically and for different purposes. I totally agree with you. And call outs can be more effective when you're addressing people who have more, power than you in some ways, or if call-ins haven't worked yet. I think I'm a big fan of, and TX and I have talked about this quite a bit, of having private conversations first, if it's wherever it's possible and safe, to call somebody in and, encourage real accountability, which is, taking ownership of harm you've caused and, making commitments and really demonstrating change so that it doesn't happen again. And that doesn't always happen when, someone's been called out. They're very defensive. But I think strategically call outs are helpful for people in power who have, been resistant to call-ins.
Yeah. I also think that call outs, if people are not afraid of accountability and they're able to, I guess, more or less be brave about it, call outs can also be a really good moment to change. It's like conflict in general. We have a tendency to think conflict is like the thing you need to avoid at all costs and it's bad and it's wrong. But like a lot of the time conflict is healthy and like it can make communities more robust and like get tension out and prevent issues from becoming bigger down the road. And, I am not a very conflict averse person in the sense of like, I don't try to avoid at all costs. I like to have the difficult conversations when they're easy. And so I know I stress a lot of people out because I'm like, no, we got to talk about this before it becomes a thing. And I think that call outs can also be a chance to change and a chance to sort of like reflect. And I don't know, there's so many thoughts I have about just like people in positions of power or leadership. Like I've seen them get called out and then the way they respond to it is so harmful and toxic that the whatever community or subculture they're a part of becomes really damaged. And to me, I'm often more upset about that than even the thing they're getting called out for, because it's like, please have a mind to the long-term, sustainability and well-being of this group of people you're a part of. It's not just about you, and like you can respond to a call out internally as well. It doesn't have to be these big, overwrought posts about how you're the real victim and like whatever. And I wish more people could remember in a lot of these spaces that it's also not usually about any one of us individually. It's about many other things. And related to this, I want to give a small plug. Should I post it in the chat now, or how should I share this? For a YouTube video I would like to share.
Just tell me about it, and I will make sure that I put the link in the video description.
Awesome. So it's currently on Consent Academy's YouTube. It is a lecture that I gave way back in 2016. It was just after the US presidential election. A lot of people really freaked out. I was part of a nonprofit called 314 Action, which tries to get scientists to run for political offices. And I gave a lecture. It was called Speaking STEM, Communicating Controversial Science. But it was actually about like how to talk to somebody you don't agree with without it becoming an argument. And it was me and someone from the Pacific Science Center, Joy Del Ria. And it was recorded on a cell phone, so it's not like an amazing recording or anything. But the sort of things that we teach there really apply to kind of any kind of sort of difficult, tense conversation. And especially in activist spaces where we're trying to change people's minds about things, I think it's got a lot of really good, basically everything I want to say about these things that we won't have time to go into today. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to also offer a plug. There's a group that I've been working with based in Western Massachusetts called Growing a New Heart, and they offer multi-day trainings on really just like this. One of them is called Dialogues Across Differences. So it's about facilitating, really much more productive conversations when we're talking with somebody who has a different, social location than us. There's also a training that they offer on having accountable and compassionate conversations when someone in your community has done harm.
Mhm.
And those for me have been really, I think, transformative in thinking through how I engage with conflict, how I engage with people who have done harm in ways that, help me preserve my peace to some extent. I have definitely been one of those people who jumps into a Facebook comment argument and, realize that that doesn't work. We're not going to change people's minds in the comments of a Facebook news post. We do that better in, one-on-one conversations. One of my approaches is I'll comment and say, hey, I think there's some information that you're missing. I can add something here, or I can also invite them to have a one-on-one conversation to, if I'm comfortable, to address what I think the issue is. And usually people are much less defensive in that setting, when there is no audience. And certainly less combative, I think, when there's no audience to be had. I think that also kind of reminds me of another kind of question that we had been sort of ruminating on, is kind of the strategies we use to disrupt these kind of harmful behaviors. I know in a lot of social media spaces, media, very high profile cases of like sexual abuse, domestic violence, in particular, the defamation suit against Amber Heard recently. That's something that's been occupying a lot of our feeds. And, as a survivor myself, have been really impacted by it. But we've seen a lot of, victim blaming statements, and I think the perpetuation of a lot of myths about what trauma looks like and how people experience harm. What are some ways that you've kind of tackled these sorts of issues, or, ways we can all kind of address this when we see it happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is tough. One thing I do want to add to I do think you're right about you're not going to usually change people's minds in like the comment on a Facebook news post, but like commenting on someone who and in your friend group, I think can help. I do get messages from people I haven't talked to since like middle school or high school every once in a while being like, hey, I know we never talk about like your Facebook warrior, whatever, has like changed my mind on so many things. Thank you so much for posting stuff. And so I think that, this gives a good principle, which is like, even online, keeping the conversations more with people you actually have connections with tends to be more effective. When it comes to like being stressed out or triggered as someone who is witnessing these things, muting terms, I always recommend that, and just keeping them blocked. I also usually recommend that if you want to post about things, try not to do the like, I'm going to write the word except change one letter to a star, because that makes it harder for the people who do have the word muted, because then the tool is not going to usually pick that up and then they might see it. So I know it's like people trying to help, but it can kind of undo that. I usually like to always do content notices. I don't always remember to do it immediately. I have pretty bad ADHD, and sometimes, especially when emotion is high, I can be so quick to like post to the thing that I forget. But I always try to do a content notice just to let people know, hey, I'm going to talk about these things. And on like a Twitter thread, it's not as good because you might see any one random tweet first. It could be better. There are lots of things that could be helpful. I would love it if all of these different platforms included just like a baseline ability to like say, I'm going to flag all of these tweets of mine or this whole post with this content notice, and people can then get that information more clearly. But then other things are just like, take a break, really take care of yourself first. I think we often can forget that we need to keep ourselves as a baseline sort of okay to often be more effective in these spaces and not get burnt out. And then I think, it's so tough because like the last time I really tried to do this sort of thing in a friend group, I lost several friends because there was a situation where someone had been assaulted by someone in our friend group. It was very public. This other person who was not the primary person harmed, like they weren't assaulted, kind of made it about themselves and got really angry at how the person who had been assaulted kind of talked about things online. And it got very victim blaming. And it was very much like, doesn't she realize how much she's harming us because she dared call this out? And like, it got very, very toxic. And I tried to talk about, hey, this is victim blaming and shaming, and like victim blaming and shaming are also different things. And like shaming the person for their reaction to harm they've experienced, or saying that they're responsible for like the fallout or something, is like really not healthy. And also like, there are layers to harm, right? Like we're not all the protagonist of the story of every harm. And like, I tried really hard to like be part of this conversation that got very, very toxic very quickly. And it just resulted in like a complete mess. And so it's one of those things where if you want to intercede in these spaces, proceed with caution, because sometimes people can get really upset about it if you try to keep it at the sort of local levels. Because people like to talk about these issues often in the abstract, but not our role in these things. It's similar to things like talking about racism. People want to talk about it in the very hyper individual or the universal level, but never the collective level, never looking at like collective responsibility or anything like that. People get very uncomfortable with those conversations. And then anything that could actually be personal, people tend to also get really stressed out by it. And I even tried calling these people in and talking individually, and it got worse. So I don't necessarily have like a good, like, here's what to do. It's more like I've tried a lot, and some things have worked sometimes and not worked other times. And, the one other thing I would say to that is what makes it so I don't feel super disheartened by that is remembering it's not about me. And it's also, I'm not alone in this. Even if I felt alone in that particular situation, there are like tens of thousands of other people who are doing the same kind of work I'm doing and trying to push these things and trying to create change at local and larger levels. And so if I have one bad experience in these spaces, it doesn't mean everything's for naught. It's like, okay, this one situation didn't work out, but everything's going to be okay in the broader context. I'm not sure how well that answers the question though, because I really just have like difficulties with this particular skill set. I haven't found a good solution to it yet.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly understandable because it's difficult, it's complex, it's messy. When we are trying to support, survivors of harm in our immediate community, it's very difficult because, like, kind of like you said, we don't all realize that we all have a role to play in creating a safer community, whether it's online or, in meet space. We all do have a role to play in supporting people who've experienced harm, validating, what they've experienced and what they're going through, and, calling in the people in our community who do harm. It's always messy. No one wants to be called in or called out. And no one wants to get involved in some ways because it is uncomfortable, but it is worth doing because we can, create safer and more inclusive spaces.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's just worth it.
For sure. Some of the things just to like follow up to this is that, when I want to talk about like harm in sort of in a broader context for a second. Like when harm happens, we often really get fixated on like who is responsible for harm. And my perspective, very much from Native American culture and transformative and restorative justice, both which came out of Black and Indigenous cultures, is not the idea that who is responsible, but that harm creates responsibilities. And so like the person who maybe caused harm, yeah, they're responsible for like understanding what they've done, understanding why it was harmful, apologizing and making amends if possible, and learning how to not do those things again. And like other things like that. The person who experienced harm or the people who did, they're responsible for their own healing. They can get support for it. They can ask for help, but fundamentally they can't put it on anybody else. But the responsibilities don't end there. There's also the people around everything. Like somebody who, say, sexually assaults somebody, generally speaking, doesn't just wake up one day and decide to do this. They've usually crossed thousands of thresholds in public view and received no or very little pushback to the behavior, and it's really excused. And so we all have then a part to play in, how many times did this person like make really sort of objectifying comments about people, privately that I just laughed off, or like how many times did I like notice these sorts of things and not say anything? And it's not to say like, oh, it's all my fault and I'm a bad person. No, it's more to say like, this is where we can start to institute change. We can, as a group of, friends or coworkers, start to say, where can we also then change the structures we create to help prevent this kind of thing from happening again, or reduce the risk? And then an organizational level thing as well. Like this group of people, we were brought together through this organization and these projects. And I would have also loved to see like anything from the sort of leadership there around not just like, kicking this guy out to cause the sort of initial inciting incident, but then there was nothing done to sort of like keep everything else healthy and like work on things. And I don't blame the people who are in leadership. I think they had no idea even how to do that, and were just sort of so stressed by it. They wanted to kind of like back away and be like, I don't want to think about this. Let's just move on. But it's like, the community knew about what was happening. All the people who were like, came to our stuff knew what was happening, but we didn't do, I think, enough to really like bring them in and give them tools and resources to process, build greater community cultural change, talk about things like consent more, talk about like have even a real conversation about it. Instead, it just turned into this like weird war of gifs on Twitter. I'm not even joking. And like, then we all kind of scattered, and that group of people, we don't, even the ones of us that were not in conflict with each other, there's nothing. There's no like real connection and coordination anymore. And that's a big loss. And I think that thinking about harm on all these different levels, rather than just like, there's the good person and the bad person, and like, that's it. It's like, well, it's always more context to it. It's not to say that the person who caused harm isn't ultimately responsible for the choices that they made, but there are also things that encouraged and enabled those choices. And I really also tried to call my partner and I for, the men in this group of people to do like a men's consent support group and like actually talk to each other, because this guy sort of behind the scenes was saying really sexist, objectifying things about me and some other women in the group. And all these guys would just kind of laugh it off and not push back or really do anything. And we all found out about it afterwards. And then there was no follow-up. There was nothing. We just kind of dropped it. And I feel like that's also like a real tragedy of, because our connections were also primarily online, and we could have done so much. This could have ultimately been a thing that created a lot of growth and healing for the community at large, which was like hundreds and hundreds of people. And instead, it just kind of created this rot, and then the floor gave out and it was over. And I tell this story because I want it to be like a cautionary tale for people. Again, the values you have now, the structures you create now really set up what your community is going to look like in sometimes a year, 5 years, or an online space is a matter of months. And so really caring for it, tending to the spaces we create is so important.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry you had that experience, and it reflects the experiences of so many, you know, and your cautionary tale, I think, is so important to hear. We can establish, the norms that we're going to encourage. We can identify the norms that we're not going to encourage, and how we address them when it happens. I think when we've got a really good framework for, addressing harm and boundary violations, even before things get, out of hand, the stronger our community is going to be. Yeah. Do you have anything else that, you'd like to share with folks before we start kind of moving to a closing?
Difficult question, because I could continue to talk about these things with you for hours. But I think that, for anybody who's trying to create any kind of positive change, I think it's really easy to make a couple of, I would say, I don't even want to call them mistakes, because I think that they're kind of built into the system. And some of it's, I don't want to go too much into history, but like during the civil rights movement, there was really active effort on the part of things like the CIA to delegitimize a lot of activist groups, to prevent things like coalition building, to make us feel that if we don't agree on every like niche policy point, that we're like mortal enemies. And like that worked and those effects still persist. And the demands of, capitalism and all this other stuff really make a lot of grassroots activism and community change efforts harder. So the couple of things that I really want to add to this is like, if you want to try to make a difference in the world, first, see if there's an org that's in your area that's already doing this work, because there probably is, and they probably desperately need volunteers and funding. I saw after the news about the potential Supreme Court ruling related to Roe v. Wade, a lot of feminists that I knew online, mostly white women, were like, we're going to create these networks and like these secret things. And there are lots of these orgs already exist. There's so many of them, and they need funding and they need support. You do not need to reinvent the wheel. But that also brings me to the second point, ego in activism, because a lot of them did not want to hear, hey, those orgs already exist, because they wanted to be a hero. And if they weren't the person at the front of the ship commanding everything, they felt like it wasn't worth it. And that's so sad, because like any of this kind of activism is heroic. And if we remember that it's not about us, that's also so much healthier. With Consent Academy and the things we teach, sometimes people get worried about like intellectual property and like, do we have everything copyrighted all the time? And like, what if we like share our slides at the end of our workshop, what if someone goes and reuses them? And my thought there a lot of the time is like, the ultimate goal of a nonprofit should be to go out of business. Like, if the world doesn't need us anymore, that means we've achieved our goal. And like that, yes, we currently, in the state of the world as it is, we need to make money to stay alive as a nonprofit. Absolutely. And if people take our material and then feel empowered to go teach it in their own local community, I love that. And so that remembering it's not about you, and you don't have to be the person who's the front end, the face of things. It's okay if other people get inspired by your ideas and don't know to credit you. It's okay if you make some mistakes and can't be the person in leadership anymore. It's okay if like you're just doing some sort of small thing, like you're the person who brings water and snacks to the protest. Like, these are all so important. And like, the reason why this is also healthier is because it makes it so much less stressful. Remembering that you're not alone in these fights. There's so many of us working on these things together, that our fates and our liberation is all tied to each other, that coalition building is like the way to win. And like we don't have enough of that. We really get into this, like, again, if we don't agree on everything, then we're enemies. And it's like, well, probably we have so much more that we do agree on than we don't, and we'll be so much more effective together. So really just look for places where you can do good within structures that already exist, and just be glad to be part of this like sort of bigger tapestry of activism. And that's the one real thing I would love to put out into the world about creating social change.
Yeah, I love that. And that reminds me of something Miriam Kaba had said, that nothing that we do that's worthwhile is done alone. So I love that reminder to, connect with people who are engaging in the work that you want to do, and cultivating your small network, because the work that you're doing at that small community level can have a larger effect in the long run. I love that. Yeah. So thank you so much, Ariana, for speaking with me today, and thank you TX and TOCA for hosting us.
Thank you both for coming on and doing this.
Yeah. Before we really wrap up and close, I'm gonna lead us in another somatic grounding exercise just to kind of bring us back. I think you've probably seen this before, Ariana, but I'm gonna lead us with a butterfly hug, and we're going to keep doing some deep breathing. But the butterfly hug, for folks who are watching, is a method of therapeutic intervention that was developed and taught to survivors after Hurricane Pauline in Mexico in 1998. And it's designed to help, relax and calm yourself if your body is feeling kind of hyper aroused or activated. And it's really very simple. Some therapists will use it, during talk therapy. But what we're going to do is really just some more intentional breath work. If you want to do the square breathing again, or just, some deep belly breaths. What we do is you cross your arms, and your fingers are going to be kind of at your shoulders or upper arms, wherever, it feels comfortable to rest them. And we're going to alternate tapping, on each arm. You can start with your right hand if, that works for you. That's what I'll do. So I'll be tapping on my left shoulder. So I'll start with my right, and then I tap with my left. And we're going to just take some deep breaths that get all the way to our belly. You're going to want to feel your belly expand a little bit. It's hard for me to do while I'm speaking. But you can just slowly tap, alternating left and right. You can do it for, 30 minutes or 30 seconds to a few minutes. I mean, you can do it for 30 minutes if you want to. But over time, so what's this doing is this activating, the different parts of your brain. And the deep breathing is helping us, calm our vagus nerve, which connects our gut to our brain in very simple terms. And what the goal is to just help kind of calm an activated self. I know that I get very, excited and activated easily. And it's pretty common for folks who are doing this kind of work too. And, sometimes, you only need to do it for a few seconds. You can go on longer. And I really like these sorts of grounding exercises. But thank you for indulging me in some more of those. And thank you again, Ariana and TX.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to end the recording in just a moment. But if you're watching this on YouTube, the resources that we discussed during the call and other resources will be in the description of this video. If you're watching this on Twitch, I probably didn't include this clip. Yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.